Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first edition in our 2020 series of webinars focusing on biosimilars. We hope that you're all safe and well in these very strange times and coping with a completely different working environment. In light of the COVID-19 pandemic, today we're going to focus on some of the responses of the regulators and the courts to the global pandemic, and what you as in-house counsel of biosimilar companies need to be aware of. My name is Matthew Royal. I am joined by Heather Schneider, Mike Johnson and Tara Theme from Wilkie, Farr and Gallagher, who will be providing an update on the US position. And for a European perspective, I'm joined by my Taylor Wessing colleagues, Anja Lunzer and Manja Epping from Munich, Judith Krenz from Amsterdam, and Lawrence Lieberman from London. And we'll kick off by handing over to Heather to talk about the position in the US.
Thanks a lot, Matt, and welcome everyone to our first webinar of the year. We're looking forward to getting our 2020 series started, and as Matt said, hope everyone is safe and well. So my colleagues and I are going to start by talking about what's going on in the U.S. We're going to give a high-level overview today, as well as some links to some useful resources. As I'm sure you're all aware, the situation is in a state of flux, and almost as soon as we get our materials ready, we end up having to update them, but that's okay. That's what we're here for. So we're going to kick off. I'll talk a little bit about some of the pharmaceutical pricing and things that the FDA and other agencies are doing. Then Mike is going to talk about the Defense Production Act and some IP issues related to that, as well as Bayh-Dole. And then Tara is going to tell us a little bit about what the courts and the patent offices are doing to handle this pandemic. So pharmaceutical pricing. For those of you who followed our webinars over the last couple of years, this is always a hot button issue in the United States. There's a lot of legislation that's been out and been pending. And frankly, I don't know if any big, large ticket laws, broader legislation are going to be passed until after the election. But pharmaceutical pricing has not surprisingly made its way into some of the coronavirus specific things. Back in March, we had one of the first big pieces of legislation that was passed that allocated a lot of different funds, including $3 billion for the government to purchase vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. And there was a requirement that for anything the government was purchasing, it had to follow federal acquisition regulations and pay fair and reasonable pricing. And at that time, there were some Democratic lawmakers who actually tried to put a little bit more stringent pricing restrictions in there. They proposed putting in some restrictions on exclusive licenses and efforts to stop monopoly pricing for certain drugs. That language didn't make its way into that act, but I wouldn't be surprised if some things like that start popping up again as this continues. And then, of course, the largest act passed to date has been the CARES Act, and that was passed, a month ago now, originally. And the main news about the CARES Act, of course, were the stimulus checks for American taxpayers, the small business loans and programs which were recently replenished. But in addition to those sort of big ticket items, the CARES Act had provided $1 billion in relief to fund hospitals and other healthcare providers, including to help pay expenses for uninsured Americans. And then it also, as many of you familiar with the U.S. healthcare system know, a lot of people's health insurance is tied to their jobs. And as people get laid off, some of them become uninsured. A lot of times, U.S. insurance patients have to let me put my slide back there. A lot of times U.S. patients have to, if they go to out-of-network providers, they pay more. And so the CARES Act has some provisions in that would help people cover out-of-network expenses. One of which, for example, was that diagnostic providers have to make their cash prices available on a public website, and out-of-network providers will be expensed at those rates. I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I saw an article in Fierce Pharma just the other day about how this might actually give some people perverse incentives to raise those list prices on the website. And so we'll see how that plays out. Again, this is a moving situation, but we put a link here to the Health and Human Services CARES page, including the general distribution portal that will be opening soon for hospitals to apply for funding. Another issue, of course, has been pharmaceutical supply chain. And as many of you know, the U.S. has been engaged in a lot of different trade activities and tariffs with China and other countries. And this pandemic has caused sort of heightened scrutiny of U.S. Reliance on foreign manufacture of drug products and medical devices. So the CARES Act requires the Secretary of Health and Human Services to enter an agreement with the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine to prepare a report on the U.S. medical product supply chain. That report has to address the supply of critical drugs and devices, the risks associated with reliance on manufacture outside the U.S., has to address any supply chain information gaps, and then address the potential economic impact of increased U.S. manufacturing. As this project ensues, so the Secretary has 60 days to sort of enter this contract to make the report. I've heard there's going to be some public hearings and other things like that, and I'm sure we'll follow those developments as people put in their comments on the pharmaceutical supply chain. In addition, the CARES Act put in some provisions meant to mitigate drug shortages. As many of you may have heard, as sometimes announcements come out that particular existing medicines may be useful to treat COVID-19 patients, all of a sudden a drug shortage ensues. People who took that medicine, for their normal condition can't get access to it. And so one of the things the CARES Act has done has prioritized review of certain drug applications. All right, just going to go back to my slide here. Prioritize the review of certain drug applications and increase the list of drugs that manufacturers have to tell the government if they're going to discontinue manufacture or have an interruption, including extending that to certain pharmaceutical active ingredients and certain medical devices. So obviously, if you're listening to our biosimilar, particularly if you're in-house, you should work with your regulatory counsel, whether in-house or outside counsel, to determine if you're subject to any of these new requirements, this sort of expanded requirements for reporting drug interruptions and discontinuances. The link to the full CARES Act is here, and we also have some more resources showing up in the next few slides. And then another thing that's been going on are the emergency use authorizations. Since February, the Secretary of HHS determined there was a public health emergency that justifies the authorization of certain diagnostics without going through sort of a lengthy approval process. This is a very up-to-date situation. As of Monday, the FDA had granted at least 49 emergency use authorizations related to tests, and has issued various guidances to help accelerate these availability of tests. We put a link to the guidances there. Again, there are new guidances almost every day. One of the very hot topics, so to speak, are antibody tests, as everyone wonders whether or not, first of all, you can get the coronavirus more than once, as people wonder to what extent we can use antibodies that one person has to treat other patients. For many of you who are in the United States, let me go back to my slide here, or on slide 8. For those of you in the United States, especially those of us in New York who've been following Governor Cuomo's daily briefings. Antibodies have been a hot topic because the governor's brother, Chris Cuomo, has recovered from COVID-19 and is positive for antibodies and negative for the virus, and everybody is sort of watching that case to see how that will develop. And then finally, on my slides, there's some guidance for clinical trials. Obviously, it's very hard for people to have clinical trials when patients and doctors may be affected, when travel is locked down, et cetera. And so the FDA has put out a guidance in March, which was just updated on April 16th. We put the link to that there to try to figure out a way to continue clinical trials and maintain the integrity of them during these unprecedented times. And so with that, I'm going to hand off to Mike here on slide 10 to talk about the Defense Production Act.
Great. Thank you, Heather, and thanks everyone for joining us today. One of the things that we wanted to talk about here is obviously the President has made 2 executive orders under the Defense Production Act, and for those of you who aren't familiar, the Defense Production Act was actually a War Powers Act that President Harry Truman passed in 1950 in response to the Korean War. And basically, the idea being that the executive, the President, could order companies to make stuff for the war efforts. There has been the use of that by the President to encourage GM and others to make products, respirators, and N95 respirators and ventilators and other things in response to the COVID pandemic, which is interesting of itself. But what we thought was perhaps more interesting was the IP implications of that, because the President can actually require third parties to make goods requested by them, but they can't create a compulsory license, and there's nothing about sort of patent rights in the Defense Production Act itself. So there's been talk about what are the potential implications. And there's been 2 sort of main ideas that have come out as to whether or not someone who performs services under one of these executive orders under the Defense Powers Act, whether or not they would be protected from any patent liability that may be incurred by doing this. And the first section that has gotten notice is 28 USC 1498. And 1498 is a somewhat little-known provision that basically says that if the United States government or someone working on their behalf is alleged to infringe a patent or actually a copyright, that the sole and exclusive remedy is to sue the U.S. government in a specific court, the Court of Federal Claims in the United States. And basically, the big questions here are twofold. One is, does the executive order under the Defense Production Act trigger 1498? Does the requirement that these parties make these goods and make them available generally, does that mean that the person is making stuff for the United States government or essentially becomes a contractor of the United States government? And I think a lot of that's going to depend on the exact wording in this. And to the best of our knowledge, 1498 has never been used. 1498 has never been used in response to a Defense Production Act issue, primarily because no one's used the Defense Production Act since President Trump did it. No one's used it since it was originally created in the 1950s until now. So there's a little bit of uncertainty. But some of the issues with 1498 that are potentially useful if this does work, if 1498 applies to the Defense Production Act, is that there's no injunction available. I don't. Someone keeps moving
Mike,
the
I
slide.
think, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm going to push out slide 11 to make sure that that's there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And so there's no request, there's no ability to obtain an injunction in a clause of action brought in a court of federal claims under 1498 against the government. And the sole and exclusive remedy is sort of reasonable compensation for the government. It's more akin to a taking than a patent infringement damages. So the contractor may not be subject to liability if the Defense Production Act is subject to 1498, and a patent owner would have an inability to stop them and perhaps have an inability to recover lost profits from the United States government and just get reasonable compensation. The second issue that's been discussed in relation to sort of COVID-19 treatments in general, as well as potentially under the Defense Production Act, is the Bayh-Dole Act and margin rights. The Bayh-Dole Act was passed in 1980, and the point of the Bayh-Dole Act was actually to encourage universities to commercialize their products, when the research itself was based on a federally funded grant. Prior to this act, if you received a grant from the federal government to conduct research and made a patentable invention, the government owned it. And so what Bayh-Dole did is it gave the inventors, the researchers, the ability to retain control and ownership of their patent. The caveat to that is if you did, you have to give the United States a governmental use license, and the United States retained what it calls margin rights. And there's 4 specific provisions in the statute that allows for the government to march in or grant a license to a third party under the patented technology. The most relevant for the COVID-19 situation is if the action is necessary to alleviate health or safety needs, which are not reasonably satisfied by the contractor, the researcher. So some members of Congress have suggested, and a Congressional Research Service report on both Bayh-Dole and 1498 has been published, sort of outlining their belief that there's a justification to use either of these mechanisms to avoid patent situations. And this goes back a little bit to what Heather was talking about. There's a feeling right now in the United States, which, depending on your point of view, you may agree with or not, the patents are responsible for higher drug prices, and that patents are actually stifling innovation in some ways because of the exclusivity provided by them. And so this is what is triggering a lot of this sentiment in Congress. But the Bayh-Dole Act and the margin rights associated with it are pretty limited. One, it has to be based on federally funded research. So if the government is sponsoring new research now, that could fall under Bayh-Dole. But then there's always the question of when will products that is be available that's based on research that's just now occurring. And then older research is only subject to Bayh-Dole is if it's a result of a federally funded grant. But a lot of times what happens here, as one can well imagine, perhaps the initial research was federally funded in a university professor who then perhaps spins out a small startup company. But a lot of times, particularly in the pharma and biologic space, those companies get acquired. And it's a larger company who perhaps develops a formulation or finalizes the clinical studies and the method of treatments. So perhaps there's other patent rights in a formulation and a method of treatment that would not be subject to Bayh-Dole. Only the original compound patent would be subject to margin rights. So you could end up in a weird situation where perhaps you can license the compound, but not necessarily, get around the method of treatment or formulation patent. And then the other issue surrounding this is cost a sufficient justification? Bayh-Dole and the margin rights was really sort of envisioned in situations where a company wasn't marketing a product or was unable to market a product. If a company went bankrupt, for example, but had some really great technology, the government could step in and license it to a third party who take it to commercialization. The concept of excessive cost isn't really built into the Bayh-Dole Act. And the other interesting point is, since 1980, when this act was enacted, no governmental agency has ever invoked its margin rights. There's been specific requests by advocacy groups to use margin rights to reduce the cost of HIV drugs at sort of the height of that pandemic, which was not granted. And a more recent example, Shire was having some supply issues with their drug Fabrazyme, which is for a very rare Fabry's disease, and it was the only treatment available to patients, and people had suggested using margin rights because of their supply deficiencies, but it never occurred. So to date, no one's actually used it. It's unclear how useful it would be in the COVID situation, and there's other IP issues that would need to be considered before Bayh-Dole and the margin rights would be an effective solution. So that sort of wraps up my segment. I'm going to turn it over to Tara to focus on what's going on with the courts and the patent office.
Thanks, Mike. COVID-19 has had a pretty significant impact on how the U.S. courts are doing business. Each individual jurisdiction has promulgated its own set of revised rules and procedures for litigating during the outbreak. And as you can imagine, because each individual jurisdiction is doing its own thing, it is sometimes hard to keep track of which rules apply in which jurisdictions. However, there are some trends that are emerging and how jurisdictions are approaching specific problems. So here we've put together a short table comparing COVID-19 procedures and policies from 5 traditionally patent-heavy jurisdictions. And one strong trend we've seen is that generally courthouses are remaining open. However, there's a pretty significant caveat with that, in that open comes with an asterisk. And although the courthouses are technically open, access to the general public is severely limited in most cases. And in fact, some jurisdictions, like the Southern District of New York, are closing certain courthouses and only leaving 1 or 2 courthouses open to handle emergency matters. Other places, like the District of New Jersey, were closed, had a number of courthouses closed because personnel at those courthouses were diagnosed with COVID-19. So they were closed briefly for cleaning and have since reopened. With respect to deadlines for filing and discovery in civil matters, many jurisdictions have left the decision on whether to provide an extension up to the discretion of the individual judge. However, as you can see, New Jersey has actually taken a different approach and issued a blanket extension of deadlines in all civil matters. And from what we've seen, the extensions of filings and discovery is one area in which we've seen a lot of evolution. And it's something that if you have litigation ongoing, you should monitor carefully. With respect to hearings, again, most jurisdictions have left the decision of how to proceed up to the presiding judge. That being said, most of these same jurisdictions have also banned in-person hearings except for emergency matters. What's interesting is that a few jurisdictions, including New Jersey and the Southern District of New York, have published specific guidelines on how attorneys should be handling telephone or video conferencing, and certain jurisdictions, like the Southern District of California, also require that teleconferences or video conferences be made publicly available by posting the dial-in information onto Pacer beforehand. For jury trials, we've actually seen a very strong trend in that most, if not all, jurisdictions have suspended jury selections and trials, although the exact timings of those suspensions vary by individual jurisdiction. These policies and procedures, though, they continue to evolve, and it should be closely monitored, especially if you have something that is particularly time sensitive. It's important, I think, to get that information before your individual presiding judge, because right now the individual judges still have a lot of discretion in how their dockets are managed. Like the courts, the USPTO has also issued several notices setting forth revised policies and procedures during the COVID-19 outbreak. So the USPTO offices have been closed to the public, and all in-person meetings and hearings are being conducted remotely. However, the USPTO does remain open for filings by mail or electronically, and actually even by hand delivery. In addition, the USPTO has waived its requirement for original handwritten signatures in a lot of instances. That also facilitates filing by email or otherwise electronically. In addition, the USPTO has issued instructions on how to extend certain patent prosecution and PTAB deadlines. So the USPTO issued an order on March 31st under the CARES Act, for which you can request a 30-day extension if your original deadline fell between a certain time period. And as Heather mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this is a rapidly evolving landscape, and that is true at the Patent Office, because just yesterday they issued a revised order. And so, pursuant to its March 31st order, you could get an extension if your original deadline fell between March 27th and April 30th. However, based on the revised order from yesterday, you can now get an extension for any deadline falling before June 1st. So if your deadline fell between March 27th and May 31st, 2020, it will be considered timely filed if filed on or before June 1st, 2020. However, an extension is not automatically granted. What's a sort of unique approach at the Patent Office is that you have to include with your request for an extension a statement that the delay in the filing or the payment was quote-unquote due to the COVID-19 outbreak. And the Patent Office has very specific instructions on what that statement must look like. In addition, one wrinkle that many petitioners are facing is that many, but not all, deadlines can be extended. So there are several prosecution-related deadlines that can be extended, like office action responses or notices of appeal. You can also extend the deadline to pay your issue fee, but certain deadlines, like the deadline to respond to a pre-examination notice or to pay a maintenance fee, can only be extended if you are a small or a micro entity. And in addition, if you are litigating before the PTAB, there is a lot less certainty in which deadlines you can extend. So the regulations right now say that you can extend your patent owner preliminary response or any responsive pleadings, but for other pleadings, you need to contact the PTAB to see if you can receive an extension. And as with the extensions for prosecution deadlines, you do still need to submit a statement that the delay was due to the COVID-19 outbreak. And for those of you who are in the United States and would like CLE credit, you will need the following code. It is WFG1428. Again, that code is WFG 1428. And with that, I will hand it off to Anya from Taylor Wessing to continue.
Hi, thank you. This is Anya from Germany. We will now switch to Europe and start with Germany. A question that is very much discussed here nowadays in the background of the COVID-19 crisis is the possibility to ensure that there is a sufficient production of a presumably patented medicine or vaccine once we do actually have an effective medicine against COVID-19. And in German law, there are two different kinds of so-called forced use of patents in Germany. The first one on the left-hand side of the slide is the governmental use order, which is ordered by the government. And the second possibility on the right-hand side is the compulsory license that can be requested by private companies. In the first case, in the left column, the governmental order of use is an administrative act by the federal government. It can apply to any granted patent in Germany or any European patent with denomination of Germany when the use of the patented invention is necessary and serves the public welfare and state security. We actually never had such kind of governmental order, so it's quite a theoretic possibility, and we do not have any case law. But it is interesting to know that the German legislator already became active, and just a couple of weeks ago, it changed the law and precised that the COVID-19 crisis is a sufficient reason for such a governmental order to use a patent. So it could, for example, be applied to ensure the sufficient supply of an effective medicine or vaccine if the patent proprietor is not able to provide a sufficient amount of the product to the German people. The government may itself use the patent, or it may authorize a third party to manufacture, offer, or market the products that would normally fall under the scope of the patent. The patent owner has a right to a reasonable remuneration by the government, and reasonable remuneration is a kind of a legal term, which means it's a kind of a reasonable license fee that would usually be applied. On the right-hand side of the slide is the possibility of a compulsory license. This can be requested by a private person or usually by a privately owned pharmaceutical company upon request to the Federal Patent Court. There are two requirements. First of all, the license seeker must have unsuccessfully tried for a reasonable period of time to obtain a license from the patent holder. But we do have case law which was quite flexible in this regard, so a reasonable period of time can also be quite a short period. And the second requirement is that the use of the patented innovation must be in public interest. We do have two recent cases from the Federal Supreme Court. In the first one, a compulsory license was granted in case of an HIV drug, raltegravir, in 2017. And last year, a compulsory license was denied in the case of a biologic similar product relating to alirocumab, because the court basically said, well, the patented product is good enough and there is no public interest in having a biologically similar product on the market as well. A compulsory license may also be granted on a provisional basis in case of emergency, so it can be ordered at short notice. And also here, the person using the patent has to pay a reasonable remuneration to the patent owner, which again is kind of a reasonable license fee that would usually apply. I now hand over to Judith for the Netherlands.
Yes. Hi. Good morning and afternoon, everyone. I will first briefly say something about the European Medicines Agency and then tell you something about the situation in the Netherlands. So first of all, the EMA, like the FDA, has taken certain measures in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and some of the measures relate to pharmaceuticals in general and others to pharmaceuticals specifically to treat the COVID-19 patients. I will not go into detail, but just to mention a few things. You can also read everything on the website of the EMA, which they refresh every day, and every time new things come up, they will put it on their website immediately. One of the measures they have taken is a measure to avoid shortages of medicines, especially in this particular case to treat the COVID-19 patients. And they have put in place a system which is called the iSPOC, which is the industry single point of contact system. And in that system, pharmaceutical companies can report any issues related to the availability of both centrally and nationally authorized medicines, which are for use in COVID-19 patients. So it's kind of a monitoring system. Then there are additional requirements related to reporting side effects of COVID-19 treatments. That is, of course, very important because, well, there are so many patients and side effects should be monitored very closely. And finally, there are a number of regulatory measures to ensure the availability of medicines in general, and the reason for that is that, of course, many countries are in a sort of a lockdown situation. On-site visits are hardly possible. Exports and imports of medicines have become more difficult, so that's why the measures are in place, and I would like to mention just a few of them. GMP certificates, for example, for manufacturer and import, they have been extended for a certain period of time if they expire during these days. So they GMPs don't run into difficulty with their licenses. On-site inspections, to no surprise, have been postponed for now. Batch certification and audits are done on a remote basis now instead of on-site, and there is some flexibility in labeling, and in this respect you should think about, for example, certain language requirements which are listed for certain medicines if one cannot comply with that. That brings me to specifically to the Netherlands, to compulsory licensing. My colleague Anja from Germany has said something about Germany already, so I will keep it short. In the Netherlands, it is also possible to obtain a compulsory license, and for the Minister of Economics to grant one. That is in our Patent Act, but so far it has never been used, this specific provision, but one anticipates that with respect to COVID-19 there may be possibilities or maybe reasons to use it in the near future. So there's a lot of rumors around compulsory licensing like in other European jurisdictions. And one of the reasons to grant a compulsory license might be public interest, and that also includes limited or no availability of certain pharmaceuticals. In the Netherlands, if one applies for a compulsory license with our minister, then the patentee will also be heard and ask for his opinion, except for very urgent situations where the minister can grant a license without hearing the patentee. And after the compulsory license has been granted, of course, a reasonable remuneration has to be paid, and parties have to negotiate the license fees, and if they don't agree, they can go to court for the court to determine the license fees. I would like to ask Matt Royal from our UK team to jump in and say something about compulsory licensing in the UK before I move on to the next topic.
Thanks, Judith. That's great. Just there's not a separate slide on the UK position. It's very similar to the position in the Netherlands and in Germany, but just perhaps a few points to highlight. Like in other places, they're very difficult to obtain, and that's partly because it's very difficult to prevent use for a second illegitimate medical use once a compulsory license has been granted, and that means the courts are very reluctant to open the floodgates to allow people on the market as a sort of general rule. The second point is Crown use. So this is similar to sort of the government use that that Anya was talking about, and the Bayh-Dole and march-in rights that Mike talked about in the US. It's been used only once in the last few years in the UK, but it is now sort of, given the COVID-19 pandemic, a very relevant provision. It's also very relevant politically for the same reasons that Mike explained in the US, which is pricing. And actually, in the opposition manifesto for the last election in the UK, it was suggested that state production of pharmaceuticals should be taken on using this right. But those are some brief comments on the UK, and I'll hand back to Judith.
Yes, thanks, Matt. Then I will say just a few words on remote patent litigation in the Netherlands, and for the other jurisdictions in Europe, we will also touch upon that. What I would like to say on this topic is that, like in many jurisdictions, the courts are closed, and in the beginning one thought that that would be only for a very limited period of time. The courts in the Netherlands are expected to reopen in the near future, which is as of the 11th of May. But then the court hearings will be, the face-to-face hearings will be rather limited, mainly in situations where it is better to have a real hearing instead of a remote video hearing. So far, the non-urgent hearings have been postponed mostly, and the urgent hearings have been taken and do take place by video calls. So far, it does work pretty okay. Parties having attended the hearings are relatively happy with it. There's also a possibility to have written pleadings, but for patent litigation, that's definitely less attractive. And I should say that all the docket dates for submission of written documents, they are not postponed, so cases keep going. It's just the hearings which are postponed. It is possible in the Netherlands to attend a remote patent litigation hearing, just as other hearings as a member of the public, and then you will get a dial-in code and you can attend the hearing. And also journalists are allowed to attend hearings this way. I will keep it with that, and I will hand over again to Anya, who will explain to you about the situation in Germany.
Many thanks, Judith. Yeah, we also discuss video patent litigation. I will come to that in half a minute. Currently, the situation is similar as in the Netherlands. We basically have a shutdown everywhere until May 4th. So the courts are still working. One can file complaints and briefs and all the written things, but they have postponed basically all hearings since the middle of March. And the Düsseldorf court will have an oral hearing scheduled next week, so everybody is quite curious how this will go. But in general, court hearings with the parties present seem problematic with regard to social distancing requirements and in the light of the available room size, because usually it's a huge crowd of people attending patent hearings. And it does not seem likely that this kind of hearing might take place so soon again. The courts are keen to say that they are all equipped to have video patent litigation, so this is in principle possible. However, there are practical restrictions, so there are only a few rooms with video equipment available for each court. And it is unlikely that all patent cases can be dealt on a daily basis by video litigation. What the judges nowadays very much promote are written proceedings. This is allowed under the German Civil Procedure Code. So proceedings can completely take place by written proceedings without any oral hearing. So the judges will then give a lot of indicative orders and informative orders to guide through the litigation. However, this will not work in case where evidence needs to be taken or where technical questions are need to be discussed with the parties. But it might be a good option if there are only legal questions. This is with regard to patent litigation. With regard to the German Patent Office, basically all deadlines have been generously prolonged, except of statutory deadlines that cannot be prolonged by the law. The German Patent Office very much promotes electronic filing and asks people just to file electronically. Similar for the European Patent Office, also here all deadlines that expired on March 15 or later have been automatically prolonged until so far May 4th. There are no hearings at the Board of Appeals until May 15th. And hearings at examination divisions are postponed except if the parties agree to video conferences. And it's nowadays very much discussed whether all hearings, at least at the examination division, should by default take place as a video hearing. I'm now handing over to Matt again.
I think this is actually going to be me. It's Lawrence speaking. If we could just drop forward one. Great, thank you. So I'm just going to be talking again on the same topic about remote hearings, but from the English court perspective. There is a new practice direction which came in to force at the end of March under our English Civil Procedure Rules, Practice Direction 51Y, which essentially sets out the rules around video and audio hearings. I won't go into all the detail of that, but essentially it endorses the use of video and audio hearings. It encourages the principle of open justice to be maintained as much as possible, so that wherever possible, hearings are recorded, either audio recorded or video recorded. Also, if members of the media or indeed members of the public wish to have access to court hearings, then the parties will have to give those details. In terms of our practical experience of how this is all working, it's all working pretty well at the moment. Just a few points that are interesting that have come out of our experience. Bundles, generally speaking, it is preferable to have some of the more sophisticated PDF searchable bundles available to the judge and the other parties using technology like Magnum. because judges don't always have the sophisticated software that clients and law firms do. And it's really important to make sure that the bundles are in PDF with hyperlink content pages. Witnesses, less relevant, of course, for patent litigation, but in my field of practice, commercial litigation, fact witnesses and cross-examination of fact witnesses are very important. And what we're finding is that the advocates are managing. There is slightly less ability for the advocates to read witnesses' body language and tone and so on when working through video. And also just making sure that rather than lots of lengthy questions, given delays in speaking time and so on, short questions are more effective, and no over-speaking of witnesses. So in an in-person hearing, of course, in cross-examination, an advocate can interrupt a witness, but that doesn't really work well, and the judges don't particularly like that in the virtual scenario. In terms of intra-team communication, there are obviously a number of methods of doing that. We are finding that WhatsApp is proving quite popular. Obviously, it's available for PC as well as phone, so that makes typing messages within your legal team much more easier. And it's generally speaking, it's more reliably instant than email and more secure. One other practice direction, which isn't in the slide but is worth mentioning, which is a related topic, is we have another practice direction 51ZA, which is all to do with applications for adjournment or for extensions of time during the COVID-19 situation. The case that came out very recently, Municipio de Mariana against BHP in the English court, where the judge set out various principles to be taken into account. Firstly, in relation to whether to decide whether a hearing should be adjourned, so it could be heard in person rather than remotely. The judge emphasised the importance of the continued administration of justice, and so avoiding delays if at all possible was preferable. But also the possibility of the remote hearing and how it could be carried out in a manner that's consistent with justice must be rigorously examined before the court accepts that a just determination of the issue won't be achieved in such a hearing. And then in the same case, the judge looked at some of the principles to apply in relation to extensions of time. And the court said that they should be as short as reasonably practicable. Legal professionals must be expected to make appropriate use of modern technology. The judge even said that legal professionals will be expected to seek to rise to the challenges posed, and that would apply to expert witnesses as well. But that the court should take account of the realities of the position and avoid requiring compliance with deadlines which aren't achievable, even if that extra effort is put in by the legal team. And then the other point of note is that an extension of time that requires the loss of trial date will be granted much less readily than one that doesn't. So that was what I had to say on that topic.
Yes, so thank you very much, Lawrence. I will take over for the next topic. My name is Manja. Hello. Another issue that has come up in the context of the current crisis is the impact on supply chains and agreements concluded by biologics or biosimilars companies, and Heather has already touched on this topic for the US. So the issue is when, for example, suppliers of API or other critical raw materials can no longer supply due, for example, to shutdown of manufacturing facilities or reduced workforce, or if the country of origin has imposed a ban on export for medicinal substances. And all this can lead to the situation that the company is unable to deliver the required amounts of medicinal products in the right time, and there's a disturbance in the performance of, let's say, distribution agreements, rebate agreements, and other agreements in the country of import. The consequences depend, of course, on the allocation of risks in the agreement, but the legal framework is set by the law that is applicable to the contractual obligations, whether there's force majeure, frustration, adjustment of contract, and we will briefly look at the situation in Germany and the UK. And I would like to start with Germany on the next slide. Force majeure is not a statutory legal concept in German law. It is recognized in certain special areas such as travel contract law, and it is defined as an external event that cannot be avoided even by exercising the utmost care that can reasonably be expected. And there's case law in Germany saying that official measures such as embargoes or restrictions of production and also pandemic situations have been already recognized as events of force majeure. That being said, the contractual definition of force majeure and the stipulation of legal consequences in the agreement will always prevail over the statutory concept of force majeure up to the limits of mandatory law. What you regularly see in those clauses in the contracts is the suspension of performance obligations and termination rights. And going forward, looking at the supply chain issue, it's a good idea for companies having also included force majeure affecting their critical suppliers into the clause, so to make it clear that this will also lead to a suspension of performance obligations. In addition, one should always look at the allocation of risks in the contract, so in addition to the force majeure clause, which can be the binding or non-binding character of timelines, mechanisms of price adjustments, etc. So this is what a German judge would normally do when dealing with these types of issues. But what happens if the contract is silent, there's no force majeure clause, or the consequences are not clearly stipulated for? There's a statutory concept of impossibility to perform, which applies when it's actually or legally impossible for the company to fulfill the contracts, which can be, for example, due to a ban on exports or due to the restrictions that are imposed by the German authorities under the Act for Prevention of Infectious Diseases that Anja already referred to. The inability to perform of a supplier, so for example, supplier of the API, would normally not lead to impossibility because it is expected from the company to procure its raw materials from any source, and as long as another source is available, even if the costs would be much higher, that would not qualify as impossibility under German law. So what are the other parties' rights in case of impossibility? The other party would be free to withdraw from the contract and also to provide its consideration. There's another statutory right, which is the right to refuse performance, which only applies in very exceptional cases. And then when there's no impossibility, but the effort to perform would require an effort that is grossly disproportionate in comparison to the other party's interest in the performance. I'll give you an example in very few seconds. Also good to know that under German law, there is a right to adjust to adjustment of the contract under very limited circumstances. And that's a more flexible solution in comparison with impossibility. The conditions would be that there's an unexpected substantial change of the circumstances which unreasonably affects the economic situation of one party, and it's outside the scope of such parties' contractual responsibility, which is only very rarely the case, but the COVID-19 situation might be one of the cases, and it's expected that this will be accepted by the courts under certain circumstances to be a reason for a claim to adjust the contract. I will skip the examples in the interest of time and hand back to Lawrence to speak about the situation in the UK.
Great, thanks, Manja. Let me just, there we go. So, in relation to force majeure, there are differences to the position outlined by Manja just now in relation to Germany. The classic test for force majeure in English law is that there's an event that gives rise to a party's non-performance under the contract, and that falls within the definition of force majeure. And that the non-performance was caused by that event and only caused by that. So if there are two causes, one of which is not force majeure, that's not enough. The second limb of the test is that the event and the non-performance were due to circumstances beyond a party's control, and also that there were no reasonable steps that could have been taken to avoid or mitigate the event or its consequences. So obviously the language of the clause is critical. That is the place to spend time looking at whether, if you are met by an argument of force majeure or you wish to assert an argument of force majeure, to look at the wording of the clause in question. Some clauses have lists of events and some have including wording. So even if a pandemic is not expressly referenced in a clause, if there is including wording, then that may help in an argument that the force majeure applies. Force majeure does not include economic problems such as insufficient funds to make payment. And of course that goes to the duty to mitigate as well. Unless the clause provides for termination as a result of force majeure, termination isn't automatic in English law. If it does provide for termination, then obviously make sure that you check the survival provisions and what the consequences of termination will be. Typically, of course, as I say, subject to the language of the clause, a party is excused from performance or performance is suspended if force majeure applies and there's no liability for failure to perform. And without reliance on that force majeure clause, then the usual claims and remedies for damages for breach of contract would otherwise apply. Now, frustration is a doctrine of common law in England, which is related to force majeure but different and applies in a situation where there isn't a force majeure clause in the contract. Common law doctrine which says that an unforeseen event makes it impossible through no fault of the parties to perform the contract, but the contract hasn't catered to that. It's a very high threshold because English common law contractual jurisprudence places contractual certainty and enforceability above everything else. The effect, though, if frustration is successfully argued, is that all parties are discharged. All money paid or payable is recoverable, less any expenses that are paid out. There haven't been any major cases yet in England in relation to the application of force majeure or frustration in the context of COVID-19. And although these are difficult arguments to run, I think that we will start to see some more sympathy in the courts to these sorts of arguments during the course of the year. Then touching on some supply chain issues in relation to the biosimilar sector. So obviously manufacturing and cold chain transportation across borders is critical to biosimilars. And we will be companies will be experiencing issues around stock and production and storage as a result of COVID-19, and also unavailability of workforce and transportation problems. There may well be multiple logistics involved, road, sea, and air, several carriers in the supply chain, several borders involved. And therefore, it's always important to make sure that one's aware of the local position in each country in terms of the ability of transportation to move products across border. And of course, the dispute resolution clauses, so the governing law and the forum for any dispute that you may have with a component or supply chain. It's worth noting that unless the force majeure clause specifically provides for excuse from performance due to a third party's default, then that won't be an excuse. And so it's not possible for one part of the supply chain to blame another part of the supply chain using the force majeure argument unless the clause specifically provides for that. And also under force majeure, if the supplier obligations are suspended during the force majeure event, there may also be, and this is quite common, we see this quite commonly, a requirement to do a best workaround. Exclusive supply contracts may also still permit a purchaser to obtain a product from a third party during the force majeure event. So that's important to look at. And just be aware that suppliers might cite delay rather than an inability or a refusal to supply. And that might lead to penalties for delay rather than termination rights or loss of profits claims. So those are just some of the points in relation to supply chain issues in the biosimilars industry. I'm conscious that we're a little over time, but I just wanted to thank everybody for attending and look forward to you joining us for another webinar a bit later in the year. And if people could stay on just to complete a short survey, we would all be very grateful. Thank you very much.